So thank you to Maggie. On to session one. Is WADA in control of global doping, or is the aim of a unified code slipping away as a forlorn hope?
Yeah, it was a sad day for us, sad day for the sport. The only good thing is that we've seen that police have done great work. They've been able to catch the athletes who've been cheating. They've been able to get the guys that are doing it, enabling the athletes, so that's the only positive thing.
But do you believe that they are cheating?
Well, all the evidence suggests that, so we have to wait until the police are done, and then we can make clear statements. But according to the evidence, according to the media, then it doesn't leave much doubt.
I was already quite aware and conscious and frustrated by what I knew to be a fairly high level of doping and drug abuse in the sport of cross-country skiing.
I've had it all, chucked it all away, and I'm going to regain it all. Again and again and again.
The report clearly lays out an unprecedented attack on the integrity of the Olympic Games and sports.
The biggest doping scandal in sports history might be coming to an end. The Russian anti-doping agency will be reinstated pending some final technicalities. The decision has been heavily criticized by various athletes and national doping agencies, but is being celebrated in Russia.
The IOC's doping system and sanctions have been rendered toothless.
After examining each individual case, the Court of Arbitration for Sport upheld 28 appeals and partially upheld the remaining 11 ones.
Recent events and the challenges to the anti-doping community have shaken the confidence of athletes and the public in our ability to combat doping. When we, as the anti-doping movement, lose the public's confidence, we lose credibility.
So that's our first question for you today. Is WADA in control of global doping, or is the aim of a unified code slipping away as a forlorn hope? Do get involved using the hashtag SportRes2019. Please allow me to introduce our panel. Would you please give a very warm welcome this morning to Jonathan Taylor, QC.
Jonathan, how are you?
Take your seat, sir. Take a seat. Relax. Also delighted to welcome to our panel this morning Victoria Agar. Stage is good to see you. Good to see you, Victoria. Also delighted he's just flown in just yesterday evening, Jeffrey Kessler. Hello, Jeffrey. Good to see you, sir. Take a seat. And also, would you please give a welcome to Mr. Bill Bock. Hello, Bill. Good to see you. Thank you. Take a seat. Our panel, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you. First of all, can I just ask you to Victoria, just give us a sense of that inspirational conversation that we've just had with Maggie as well. An absolutely wonderful, wonderful story.
It was, and I would love to have heard the end of it, actually.
You're getting your mic on, yeah.
But I've never failed to be inspired by the journey and the different journeys that athletes go to in order to achieve great success. And Maggie is an incredible leader in female sport.
Absolutely, absolutely, very well said. Jeffrey, I'm going to start with you, if I may. Very good morning to you. Trust that your journey was good.
Yes, it was.
Very good. I know you've been very busy in the States. I'm just going to start with you because there's a piece in the Times newspaper this morning, I'm not too sure if you're aware of this, where today's conference is mentioned in the Times newspaper. And kicking off with WADA, just want to read a quote that you gave to the paper. There has been much scrutiny on how countries, including the United States, approach obligations under WADA and its code. In US professional team sports, collective bargaining determines all drug testing, and WADA is thus never going to rule the day. Correct? Fact?
That's true in team sports. So in the United States, we have a collectively bargained system, and the unions are very much a party with the leagues in setting what the rules are. And frankly, they have adopted all different rules for each sport, and they do not use the WADA regime on the whole. They have a different set of procedures, but they are adopted to those specific sports. I don't frankly view that as being an issue for WADA, because it is just internal to those leagues. The real issue for WADA is when you have something like the Olympics, and then you might have the NBA players going to the Olympics, and then of course they are part of the WADA system. But for the United States individual leagues, it really is always going to be a separate system.
The quote goes on to say, Jeffrey, it must accept this reality and focus on its other objectives to maintain its credibility across the globe. What is the credibility right now?
So right now, I'd say the reputation of WADA is not at its highest point in its history. There is a lot of skepticism about how it goes about its job, the degree to which politics might influence how it goes about its job, and I think there is a public questioning as to whether or not it can be relied upon when you're looking at world competitions.
Let's spin around the panel. Jonathan, what do you think?
Is it in control of global doping, or is the aim of unified code slipping away as a forlorn hope? I don't think one of WADA's objectives is to have the major league sports in the US to be code compliant. They're not a signatory. They don't have to be code compliant. The rest of them are signatories. Code is probably the most broadly applicable legal instrument there is in the world, more than any human rights instrument, more than any other legal instrument I can think of at least. Does it get enforced? Didn't used to. A couple of years ago, the compliance program at WADA was send us your rules and make sure they've got the right words in them. And that was it. Not how many tests do you do, what intelligence, what investigations do you have? Nothing. Now, there is a fully comprehensive compliance program where everyone has to submit their program, their test distribution plan, how many tests they do, how many people they get whereabouts from, how many blood tests, how many urine tests, whether they use the athlete biological passport. Now people are accountable. 3,000 corrective actions so far from people whose anti-doping programs weren't compliant and now are. So are they in control of global doping? They are now enforcing the obligations under the code to a far bigger extent than they did. Are they any good at catching people? Well, they now have an investigations unit headed by the former head of cybercrime at the German police, fairly impressive guy. I don't know how many other organisations could get the Russian state to allow them in to take away the data from the lab, and 2 days ago, 2,500 samples. Not many criminal authorities would allow a foreign body to come in and take away the evidence like that. So the Russian piece I'm happy to talk about. Obviously, I had some involvement in it. I'm happy to discuss that decision.
Yeah, we'll come on to that. Yeah.
But before that, just one last point. In terms of effectiveness, I'm doing something at the moment for International Biathlon where they have got evidence which is wiretap conversations and seized phone WhatsApp messages from the police who were tipped off and given the evidence by WADA. And so now we suddenly have a system where we're getting real evidence of real cheating. And so is it a forlorn hope? No, it's not a forlorn hope.
Victoria, let me bring you in here, and please feel free to come in at any point. Victoria, is it a forlorn hope? Do you have trust? Do you have faith in the system?
Not as it currently stands, and that doesn't mean to say that I don't buy into a robust, strengthened WADA. It's absolutely essential, and for to protect the integrity of sport from an anti-doping perspective. I just think at the moment WADA isn't strong enough in a number of areas. There's discrepancy across different countries in terms of education, testing, and that doesn't lead, from an athlete perspective, to international confidence in the organisation. And then, and I know we'll come on to recent decisions that WADA have made, but there's a lack of confidence in the credibility and the clout that WADA have in terms of making the right moral decisions.
A lack of confidence where? Within sporting organisations, the athletes?
The athlete community, the main stakeholders in elite sport.
Yeah, absolutely. Therefore, when we were looking at that film at the beginning there, Bill, as well, we also heard the public as well. So if athletes are losing faith in the build-up to an Olympic Games, a Winter Olympic Games, you know, in broadcasting, we build it up. We want our viewers, we want our listeners to watch, we want people to enjoy it, spectators to go to the venues as well. Are they losing faith?
There's absolutely been a loss of faith in the system, and for good reason. Let's not kid ourselves. We're here in 2019, and the Russian doping scandal erupted in 2014. It was percolating for years before that. WADA didn't detect it. WADA had a lab accreditation meeting in December 2013 in South Africa, 2 months before the 2014 Sochi Games. They had evidence at that point in time of potential sample switching, and it happened on their watch. So we're still talking about this 5 years after the ARD event. Nobody can look at the evidence and say that WADA has been effective at addressing the Russian situation. But you ask about professional sports in the United States, and I'd like to say one way that WADA can learn from professional sports in the United States is the involvement of players and buy-in by players in shaping the anti-doping programs within professional sport. WADA has clearly lost confidence of athletes. One of the reasons is because there is precious little athlete input into decision-making by WADA.
That was actually the point I was going to make next, which is that hearing the lack of player confidence and knowing my experience in the United States, the best thing WADA could do would be to include players in the decision-making process, to get their views, to get their buy-in, to find out what works and what doesn't work from a player standpoint. And having it just imposed by what in effect is a sports bureaucracy is a weakness in WADA. It's not a strength.
Victoria, would that work?
I mean, absolutely. It's what my number one aim on the WADA Athlete Committee at the moment is to increase athlete representation within the organisation itself. Now, there isn't a governance review. Unfortunately, at the moment, at the WADA Executive Committee, the only athlete representation isn't the chair of the WADA Athlete Committee, but it's the chair of the IOC Athlete Committee. I think that speaks volumes in terms of a voting right. And what I would love to see is greater representation at the highest decision-making, i.e. the WADA Executive Committee, from independent athletes. And I think there's a real opportunity there for athlete buy-in, for improved athlete education, and bring them into the decision-making. We're not here to cause problems. We're here to check, challenge, and make sure that the organisation...
And make things better.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How would it work then? How would you get athletes involved in that decision-making process?
Well, I think there's a number of standing committees, and I'd love to see great within WADA, and I'd love to see some really strong independent athletes on those standing committees. I'd also at least, athletes are the main stakeholder. At the moment on the WADA Executive Committee, there's significant stakeholders from government, there's significant IOC members that all have a vote. At the moment, I would really like to see some parity around athletes having an equal vote at the table as well.
Jonathan and Bill, feel free to come in at any point. Would that work?
Votes around the executive committee table. I'm supposed to be independent, so I'm not supposed to talk about those things. I think it would be a very good idea. Having said that, there is this issue about athletes, committees and representation that someone has to resolve this issue. How do you get a mandate for an athlete committee so that they are representative? It's a debate that's going on right at the moment. in terms of rules being imposed by a bureaucracy, it's kind of makes me laugh, because last week I was defending IAAF rules and someone was saying the model is WADA, because WADA, you put out the rules and everyone can consult and everyone can put in their comments. So that's a model there for consultation, and athletes are able to put in their views. And then today it's imposed by a bureaucracy. There were 2 days of meetings in the symposium with athletes, I think, in March. So there are athletes sitting there contributing to the debate about what the rules should be. There's an athlete on the code drafting team, ex-athlete, Ben Sanford, from the athletes committee. So I don't think we should say there's no involvement, but I completely understand the point. It says we need representation, we need involvement we need a vote on the executive committee, and I completely understand the point about lack of confidence too.
Well, let me comment on that. Becky Scott is the chair of the WADA Athletes Committee. Vicky's on the WADA Athletes Committee. She does not have a vote at foundation board meetings, WADA's governing board. Edwin Moses is the chair, obviously well-known athlete, chair of the education committee. He does not have a vote at any level other than in the committee. Athletes don't have a vote. And so
there's an IOC athlete that has a vote.
What's that?
The IOC athlete, they don't count. She has a vote, the chair of the IOC Athletes Commission.
Okay, so
she's
one's good enough?
No, but you just said the athletes don't have a vote.
They don't have, their voice is not recognized. You've got...
Except an IOC athlete, and that doesn't count.
Well, the WADA represents more than Olympic sport, and I know that WADA is funded by the IOC, essentially. I think you need to have a greater diverse range of people that have different perspectives other than just an IOC athlete committee member. And I think it's important to remember that.
I mean, ideally what you would have is that the athletes should have an equal control with the rest of WADA, because they are really the constituency for this. And again, that's sort of, I'm going back to the US model of collective bargaining. The way these systems get established is that the athlete side has to agree with the management side, and then you come to an agreement. Having just athletes have a voice is not the same as having power. Yeah. And what we're really talking here is about power. And by the way, the United States is not a perfect model. We have enormous problems in the US in other areas. For example, all of USA Gymnastics, as everyone knows, has been victimized by a horrific scandal of abuse. And part of the problem there was no athlete power or control within the USA Gymnastics organizations. It's a very similar issue in terms of this is a very important issue for the future of sporting movements, about giving athletes appropriate, not just a voice, but authority to help determine the future of these organizations.
But that's really interesting. I'm sure we'll come on to that in our sessions this afternoon as well. But at which point then, Bill, do we give the athletes a voice? Does it start when they're starting out in college sports, so that they get used to the system, so if indeed they reach professional sport? Is that what we're talking about here? Getting greater voices from our young sports stars of the future?
Well, I think what we're talking about is WADA governs the Olympic movement. And the Olympic movement is extraordinarily bad at inclusiveness and input. And WADA kind of exacerbates that bad model of Olympic sport, where there isn't much dissent, there isn't much debate. If you go to an IOC meeting, I've never been to one, but I've watched the results of their votes, and not many legislative bodies that are in democracies have votes of 101 to 0, or 100 to 1, or 99 to 2. Those are the sorts of votes on issues that you see at the IOC level. Athletes have a vested interest in clean sport. Most of the athletes that I talk to in cases, even the ones that dope, don't want to dope. And so I firmly believe that if we empower athletes, if we have a substantial percentage of athletes involved in the governance of sport, they're going to make decisions in their self-interest to have clean sport.
But hold on a second, Bill, because here, as a sports fan and a sports broadcaster, you say all athletes want a clean sport. As a sports fan and a sports broadcaster and a dad of kids who play sport, I want clean sport. Victoria wants clean sport. We all want clean sport, don't we? It's not just the athletes, it's everybody. We all have a vested interest in clean sport.
Well,
What are you kind of hinting at?
What I'm hinting at is that there is obviously economic incentives to put resources in one area or another. And so clearly WADA is under-resourced, and a paltry sum from the multi-hundreds of millions of dollars made in Olympic sport go to anti-doping. WADA's annual budget is in the neighborhood of $20–30 million a year. So resource decisions are being made by people that have a conflict of interest, number one. Number two, I think the Russian doping scandal that we started off talking about is strong evidence of political interests that can control the system. And not just at the end of the process, which Jonathan was involved in with the CRC, bringing RUSADA back into the fold. That needed to happen at some point, but at the beginning of the process, the very WADA roadmap for bringing Russia back included no interviews of government officials, no interviews of sports officials, no investigation of the individuals involved at the anti-doping laboratory that were supposedly hiding samples or exchanging samples. There were broad areas that were just completely left out of the original roadmap that should have been included. Why were those decisions made? I don't have confidence it wasn't because of political reasons and the belief that Russia needed to be brought back too quickly.
Let's bring Jonathan in. Politics and economic benefits.
Well, as to the roadmap, understand the code compliance system, when the code came out, they were focused on athletes. There was one article about signatories, not criticising them. The focus was on athletes. They were trying to harmonise a code. So there weren't provisions relating to compliance by signatories. There was no system for WADA to bring about consequences. None. One of the things people criticise WADA for is you didn't do enough with Russia. I defended 2 bans by the IAAF and by the IPC at CAS, banning the Russian athletes from Rio. The first question they ask, the CAS asks, where are the rules that allow you to ban them, impose consequences, and impose conditions for reinstatement? The answer for WADA before the new system was there aren't any. So you can criticise them for not imposing conditions. Actually, that roadmap was quite a feat because there was no basis for it. And if the Russians had challenged it, it would have all gone. So everything's in context. Everyone would have liked a proper set of rules before. We've got a proper set of rules now. And the decision that we made allowed us to get them into the new system, which means there are now significant consequences. And guess what? That's why we've now got the data, and that's why we've now got the samples. We talk about wanting to get to the bottom of the Russian scandal, wanting to prove things. Lawyers like evidence. Lawyers don't like to have allegations that people can just deny. They like evidence. Well, now we've got it.
Victoria, what was your view on the Russian doping scandal?
I didn't feel that it was appropriate with regards to the timing to reinstate RUSADA when the Compliance Review Committee suggested that WADA should. I'd like to just bring things back. You know, I understand the need for legal robustness, but I'd like to bring it back to the simple matter of principle and fair points from an athlete perspective and the experience. You know, you don't allow someone to return to competition having not fulfilled the requirements that were set out. An athlete would never be able to just come back halfway through a doping ban without proving their innocence. you have to be fair and transparent. The communication was shocking to athletes on that, by global athletes, I mean, in terms of the decision making from that perspective. And I feel, that we have to just think about the damage that was done and the loss of credibility and trust that athletes have. And we're not just talking about a minor thing here. This was the biggest doping scandal that's hit. It was state-sponsored doping, and it didn't just impact. And people talk about medals being retrieved and samples that have been taken back. We don't know if they've been authenticated yet. We don't know if they're actually real samples. Yeah. And yet Russian athletes are still back competing. And it's the athletes that lower down that have been also affected, those that didn't make a top 8, that perhaps their careers ended, that we never heard about, never had the opportunity to fulfill their potential. That the impact on that doping scandal was more about changing a bronze medal to a gold medal. And it was that significant that athletes cried out to think, where is that legal robustness? Where's the fairness in making Russia compliant again? And I understand Jonathan's perspective around trying to strengthen the conditions now, but actually it comes back to principle, and sometimes it's more important around not just what you're trying to do, but the way you do it.
Jeffrey?
Well, I think there is a lot of merit in both the fact that WADA clearly should have been empowered to do more, but I also am sympathetic to the idea that was made that WADA perhaps didn't have adequate powers in the first place. So this is not just, let's not just bash WADA. Let's bash the whole system, right? Because this goes back to the IOC. It goes back to the individual sporting federations around the world, that if they're not going to stand behind the system to create a robust set of rules and enforcement, then nothing's going to happen. And it's to further add to this, you also have to have a fair system. I mean, frankly, a side product of all this is that there were some Russian athletes who did not dope, who were swept in to the overall scandal, and we needed a fair system to evaluate them individually as well in terms of this. So the whole mechanism really broke down, and there's really very little positive to say about the entire Russian doping scandal at almost every level. So, but I think rather than condemn all that, because that's the past, what we really should talk about is how we can build a better system. And some things have improved. There are some new rules. I think there's a lot more that could be done, including the points of giving real power and voice and influence to the athletes in this process.
Bill, what do you think about that? Because it's a really good question, isn't it? And how we move on. It's kind of like what we're talking about here in the forlorn hope and the unified code as well. What is the perfect scenario?
Well, the perfect scenario is having a governance system that is truly transparent, that is truly independent, and that has enough interests around the table that people don't have confidence that decisions are being made for political reasons. I disagree to an extent with what Jonathan says, because I think Jeffrey got it right. The IOC had a big role in the Russia doping problem. Yes. They had the opportunity to stand up and follow a WADA recommendation in the first instance in 2016, not to allow the Russian team to participate in Rio. They did nothing. You could say that they did something. They had a process that had widely disparate results in various sports. Jonathan represented the IPC, and he upheld the exclusion, or worked to uphold the exclusion of the Russian Paralympic Committee from the Rio Games. That could have been done by the IOC on their side of the house, and held Russia and the Russian Olympic Committee could have been held to the high standard that athletes are held to every day. Now, by 2018 in Pyeongchang, the Winter Olympic Games, WADA flip-flop, and political interests had carried the day, and they no longer recommended that the Russian Olympic Committee not participate. And really, the sports system in Russia has not been held accountable by it. And so we hold athletes accountable to the highest penalties. We've sanctioned athletes and coaches with lifetime periods of ineligibility. But yet, when we have the most significant scandal of all time in doping, we say that we're powerless. We say, well, we've fixed it now because we've improved the rules. That's a cop-out. What really needed to happen was that people at all levels in sport, in international federations and at the IOC, as well as WADA, needed to stand up and call a spade and say, we're going to protect clean sport. That didn't happen. So the scandal points to the fact that governance in sport and at WADA is broken.
So therefore, Jonathan, and again, I'm pretty sure this will be a theme throughout the day when we're talking about gambling, when we're talking about racism, especially in football, as we've seen. Is that not the only, as Bill says, the clear message that you send out to countries, to athletes, to sporting organisations? Flout the laws. You dope, you're out.
So flout the laws?
Flout the laws. If you dope, you're out. Is it as clear cut and as simple as that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because when we talk about racism this afternoon, I'm pretty sure that many people will be saying that. If you're caught chanting racist abuse in a football stadium, if you're doing it on social media, you're out of the game.
I agree. That's why we've put in place a system that sanctions signatories in the same way as it sanctions athletes. It's the same system. Under the anti-doping code, if an IF or a NADA goes against an athlete and gets a ban, once it's a final ban, everyone has to recognise it. Now, against signatories, if WADA goes and says the Russians have tampered with the data, we don't think they should go to Tokyo, if the CAS upholds that, then the IOC is stuck. It doesn't get to decide for itself. We fixed the problem. Is there anything I could do about the fact that the rules were not good enough before? No, I can't go back in time and fix them. But we fixed them now, so that if there's cheating now, then WADA takes a case, takes it to CAS. If it gets a ban, and one of the provisions in the international standard is exclusion from the Olympics. And if that's upheld, everyone has to recognise it. So the IOC no longer gets to make the decision.
Jonathan,
so there you go, Bill.
The system, respectfully, the system is still broken because your committee doesn't make the final decision. The WADA Executive Board makes the final decision, and their committee, and that comes from the Foundation Board, and you've got 50% governments and 50% sport representatives, and sport rules the day at WADA, and the vast majority of the decisions are made. The system is still broken, and we can only expect good results when we have a better system. Compliance was part of the picture, but it wasn't the whole picture, and we'll be right back here when another powerful country has a state-sponsored system in another 10 or 15 years, because the ultimate decision-making power is not dispersed, and it's still the way it was before this scandal. That hasn't changed. A few rules have changed. Your committee has more power, and I think those are great changes. But the basic underlying system still doesn't involve athletes in decision-making and still hasn't changed.
I would agree with that, and I think the two things that when I had the opportunity to speak to the Director General and the Chair of WADA, the first one was you must have greater athlete representation across the Executive Committee and all the standing committees. And secondly, what are you doing about diversifying your income, making yourself not so reliant on the IOC, because that's imperative to credibility, to the trust from the athlete community, and they hadn't even considered it. So from my perspective, they said, well, we've got one donor. And for me, if I was in that position, I'd be going hell for leather trying to re-establish a level of independence where and explore numerous ways of making us not so reliant on the IOC, so that perhaps we could react or in a way that was much more independent.
To protect the integrity and the reputation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it really does come down to governance. It's the pervasive conflicts of interest that are built into international sports governance. Doping is really just one aspect of this. It's the same reason why you get all different types of scandals in international sport, because there is not a governance system that is, as you said, sufficiently dispersed, sufficiently free of conflict from the decision makers who are frequently deciding things that affect their own economic interests or their own sporting interests. And that's just a basic governance problem in international sport.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about funding then? Because I think, Bill, you talked about funding, and is that what we need? Do we need more money being ploughed in, and where does that money come from?
Well, let me start by saying you don't need more money if you're going to make the same bad decisions, right? We got plenty of money in sport, but it has to be spent effectively. What is the percentage of funding that goes to anti-doping? I think that it's probably less than 1% of total revenues of the IOC. And the IOC doesn't even provide all the funding for WADA. They expect governments to pay half of the funding for WADA. So the resources are there at the sport level. Sport has to pay its way. It owes it to the athletes. And, you know, I think we're here to talk about doping, but if the sorts of reforms that Jeffrey and Vicky are talking about are extended, I think we're going to see a lot more resources go in different places than they go right now, because I think athletes in Olympic and Paralympic sport are frankly taken advantage of when it comes to the massive revenues that come from television contracts.
And so the question is, where do these revenues go? Okay, right now in international sport, they're given out to buy votes. Okay, the voting structures are such that you run organizations where you say, okay, your federation will get this grant of money for your sport in exchange for your supporting the hierarchy on votes. It's an inherently conflicted system. That's why the resources aren't going more to anti-doping or to other uses, because it greases this entire international system of how this governance is structured together.
So therefore, we're painting a pretty depressing picture, aren't we, Jonathan, of economic gain and vested interests?
Yes, there's definitely a number of conflicts of interest, dare I say, even with some governments, which is why the WADA system has IFs watching NADOs, NADOs watching IFs, and WADA watching both. Personally, it can work. I've seen many times where NADOs have issued a decision and the IF or WADA has said, that looks like a hometown decision. I'm going to appeal it, take it to CAS, get it fixed. I've seen plenty where an IF has issued a decision. NADO's appealed it, WADA's appealed it, taken it to CAS, got it fixed. So that's how the conflict of interest system works within the cases themselves. In terms of the executive committee, well, it's 5-5. I think USADA's pretty good at holding the decisions to account. They're quite good at working the press, saying that's an outrageous decision. Question really is whether that's enough. There's going to be how many is it, 2, 3 independents on the board, on the executive committee with the governance reforms? You tell me, you don't want sport to have a vote there? What are they going to do? How are they going to react when you say no vote? Do you want to take away their funding? You want more IOC funding? You don't want the IOC to fund it at all? Who's going to do that funding then? Are the governments going to come in and do it? No, they're not going to come in and do it. So I agree with all that. These are all issues, and there are some great sound bites, but you've also got to think it through. You've also got to work out how it's going to work in practice. Now, I go to those executive committee meetings. I can see for myself what the problems are. But, you know, the question is whether you want to just tear it down or whether you want to suggest something that you think is a better alternative. Bill, you tell me, how many athletes on the USADA board of directors?
There are 3 on the USADA out of 9, 1/3.
Serving athletes? I mean, active athletes?
We've got 2 active athletes, and Edwin Moses is our chairman.
Okay, so that's 2 out of 9. Okay, so we do something like that at the Exco. That would work.
I think it needs to be. It's a third. I think it needs to be a third. Personally, I think at the Exco, and I don't think it actually matters whether you're a serving athlete or a retired athlete. I think both can bring a lot to the table. I think if you're a serving athlete, the time and the commitment and availability is not perhaps what it could be to help and really be on top of the issues. And I think once you're an athlete, you're always an athlete, and you've got it in your blood, and you've lived and breathed it. So you can be just as helpful as a retired athlete.
But then if you're counting retired athletes, there's loads of them on the Exco.
Not in the acting as the athlete perspective. They are conflicted because they represent another organisation. Right. And that's the reason they're on the table.
By the way, do get involved on the old Twitter as well, please. We have had a couple of questions, and let's do one now, and let's kind of bring it back to one of our main questions of the day as well, and it's from Sports Integrity, so thank you very much indeed for tweeting us. Jeffrey, I'll start with you, and then we'll spin around the table, and then Michelle will pick up on your comment as well. And this is the question from Sports Integrity. Does the United States approach regarding bans levied on the basis of number of games make sense for team sports globally, given that a 4-month WADA ban could apply in the team sport off-season?
Yes. It makes no sense to say you're imposing discipline when the athlete's not playing. I mean, I think that's sort of obvious. And certainly in the U.S., the way in which they've imposed and agreed upon this there's merit in 2 ways. One is it's focused on specific numbers of games or contests. But second, there's also a certainty about it. So in the systems that have been negotiated, people know if you have a first offense, this is what the penalty is going to be. And if you have a second offense, this is what the penalty is going to be. And the third offense, it's usually a ban from the sport in terms of performance enhancing drugs. That's almost in all of the sports. That's how it's been negotiated. And that certainty provides both guidance and deterrence. And you know, yes, that the penalty is going to actually be effective, not just take place when, you know, it can't be manipulated.
Just run through, because I think a lot of the audience will understand what happens in terms of the Olympics, but in terms of US sport, what are the differences? If an athlete is caught doping in the NBA or the NFL, what are the differences? And just give us a flavour of what sort of bans you're looking at.
So again, they're different length seasons. Yeah. In the NFL, the first offense for a performance-enhancing drug is 4 games. So there's a 16-game season, so you're missing 25% of the season. The second offense is 8 games, so you're missing half of a full sporting season by doing that. And then the third offense in the NFL is a complete ban, but for which you can apply for reinstatement after 2 years, not earlier than 2 years, and that's the negotiated outcome. There are similar systems in the NBA and in Major League Baseball. Just because of the length of the season, you get it slightly
the same.
Yes, slightly different things. Like I believe in the NBA, the first offense is 20-something games, because there you have an 82-game season. So again, but it's a comparable type system.
Yeah.
Bill?
And then Major League Baseball is 80, 162, and then the lifetime ineligibility.
Right, okay.
And the other thing about the programs is that they don't spend a lot of time dealing with fault or no fault, intent or no intent. they simply impose the sanction, and there are far fewer exceptions. And in the code system, we've got a 4-year period of ineligibility for a non-specified substance unless the athlete can reduce it to 2 by proving they didn't intend to enhance performance. And then you've got all kinds of factors that can be considered under the athlete's degree of fault to set a range between either 1 and 2 years for non-specified substances, or for specified substances, 0 and 2 years. And it makes you wonder sometimes about the amount of time and effort and already scarce resources that are being spent on this system that is fairly arcane, and whether we ought not to have more standardized periods of ineligibility and remove a lot of the fighting over 2 and 3 months on a suspension that tends to happen in the Olympic movement.
Thank you to Michelle Verhoeven for her question as well. And Victoria and Jonathan, just come to you on this. Is the issue the ban should be sport-specific rather than a one-size-fits-all? Victoria, what do you think?
Should it be sport-specific?
Sport-specific, yeah, or a one-size-fits-all?
I think it's one-size-fits-all. You cheat, you deal with the consequence.
As simple as that?
Simple as that.
Jonathan?
I'm 100% with Vicky. Talk about proportionality. That's why they have these fault provisions rather than fixed bans. And people can say, well, the effect on me is much greater if it's a year because I only play, 30 games in my whole of my career. Whereas an equestrian athlete spends 30 years competing, so it's just not fair. So it's different. But it's not proportionality about the individual. It's the effect on the whole, effect on everyone who plays sport. If you lose confidence, if you see a doper, you lose confidence in that sport, you lose confidence in every sport. So every sport has an interest in a strong message, sending out a strong message. We've got to go as far as is necessary to protect public confidence in sport, and that means strong bans across the board.
One size fits all? Go on, Vicky, you coming in, and Jeffrey, you come back in.
I agree that it's about protecting the integrity of sport, but more from my perspective, it's about athlete welfare, duty of care. You know, the supplements that some of these athletes take have a long-term effect on their health, mental health, physical health, and significant, particularly with female athletes not being able to have families. You know, there's a massive long-term consequence, so we can't lose sight of that. It's not just about protecting what we see on the television screens, it's about protecting the individuals involved that would do anything to stand on the podium or win a game or whatever it is.
It's a really important message, and look at that, it's taken us 35 minutes to get to that point. It's a really important message on a human level. Jeffrey, just pick up on Victoria's point there, and then we'll come back on to the one size fits all.
So I will, and to illustrate that point and what happens when you get athletes involved, in the NBA, for example, it was the players' union that pushed for the introduction of performance enhancing substance testing. Not the owners, not the teams, ironically. And it was primarily because of the concern about athlete welfare in terms of the history of that bargaining. So yes, the health effects of some of this are very important from the athlete standpoint. I am going to be a dissenter, though, on looking at it from the standpoint of different sports. I do think, while I agree that there needs to be a strong message in all sports, I also come from a standpoint of individual athlete fairness. And I think if in some sports a particular penalty might be disproportionate to the length of their career, versus another sport, I think that's something that should properly be taken into account. In other words, I don't think necessarily, I think it's one message for all, but I do think there should be a sense of fairness and proportionality to the athlete as well.
Isn't that message loud and clear, as Vicky and Jonathan say? Isn't that message loud and clear? You cheat, you're out. Well, no matter which sport you're in, no matter which career you're in, no matter how long you're out injured, no matter how long you're out on the sidelines.
Well, again, from the standpoint of fairness, I would not be in favor of saying one time you're banned for life. I do think we don't treat criminals that way, okay? So let's keep a sense of proportion. If someone robs a bank, they don't go to prison for life the first time that they rob a bank. And so we have to recognize that we're all fallible.
Jonathan, what did you say?
I said the code doesn't say you're out for life if you
No, I know that. I'm responding more to the question that I do think there should be a sense of proportionality. And again, just like in the sports, it would make no sense to say in baseball in the United States, which has 162 games, that it should have the same ban as football, which has 16 games. You could say, okay, just, there has to be some sense of proportionality to the sport.
I'll come to you, Bill. Victoria, the athlete's view on that? Sense of proportionality?
I would argue that misinformed matches wasn't proportional to an athlete that perhaps has taken a performance-enhancing drug that could potentially impact on their health, and it comes back to the fundamental principle. I think when you're looking at sanctions, they need to be significant enough for what the athlete has done, and I think that's the only way you're going to get a level of prevention that will deter athletes from even thinking about it in the first place.
But how significant?
I agree that perhaps first offence isn't life, and I've moved from that position. When I was a competing athlete, I say you cheat, you're...
Because there are many athletes who say that.
Yeah, and I used to think that way, and I think probably being on the WADA Athlete Committee, and from a British perspective, I'd argue that actually the education, everything, the right of where we're born in terms of the opportunities, I perhaps think that if you cheated, you've been given every opportunity not to. It's a conscious decision, whereas there's cultural issues, there's lack of education globally with some of the other athletes that I have perhaps a little bit more sympathy for them or empathy for them than I would have done. But I think certainly you can't have repeated offences. Yeah. You do it once, you serve a significant sanction. You do it twice, you're out.
You're out. Bill?
I think there's a real risk that the system that's been created exists to scapegoat athletes and ignore the deeper underlying problems in sport that create the willingness to dope. Sometimes athletes feeling like they have to dope. We're not, frankly, doing a very good job at catching the coaches, catching others in the entourage, people on the teams or team directors, and holding them accountable. And we know that the system has got problems in terms of governance, and we know that we ask athletes to do almost superhuman, impossible things, like in the Tour de France, and we don't think about the perverse incentives that creates, the incentives where you only pay athletes or you significantly pay athletes only if they medal. There are a lot of things about the system that we need to think about rather than just how hard can we punish these athletes. And I think that is an aspect of proportionality that has gotten lost, is that athletes are held out here, they're excluded from life, and the coach that had 5 or 10 of those excluded athletes that are excluded from life, he continues to coach and make his salary. In terms of proportionality, this system needs to stop looking at athletes as the main cause of the doping problem, because I don't buy it. I don't think that individual athletes are the main cause of doping in sport.
You think there are people around them?
I think there are people around them. I think there's an incentive system that's been set up. And I don't think that the system that we've got to detect and deter doping is as good as it should be because of all the conflicts of interest.
Jonathan, can I just go to Jonathan, just get his view on proportionality, and then we've got a question from Kevin Carpenter, which just come on Twitter. Proportionality, Jonathan.
Same as I said before, the purpose of these rules, as Vicky says, is to deter people from doping. The only way you do that is by having a sanction that actually means something. I'm having the same debate in the International Standard for Co-Compliance by signatories. So, well, the Olympic Games, you shouldn't exclude them from the Games unless that should be the last resort. I said in the WADA symposium, not if that's what it takes to get people to comply, the threat of being excluded from the Olympics, then it should be the first resort. So proportionality means not going further than is necessary. It also means going as far as is necessary to achieve the objective. People forget that side of it.
Okay, thank you. Jeffrey, just come in, and Victoria, and then we'll move on.
I was just going to say, I think there should be a system for looking at others, whether it's the coaches or whether it's the organization that is encouraging that. The most obvious historic example of that was the East Germans back when their first sort of major doping scandals. There's no question that those athletes were in many cases coerced into being doped for the sake of what East Germany wanted to achieve at that time. And I do think there are sporting organizations who, if they do not specifically coerce their athletes, do nothing to discourage them and in fact encourage them because they are focused on their own medals and achievement and put pressures that really should be examined beyond just the individual athlete.
Yeah. Victoria, you were going to say?
Yeah, no, it was just to re-emphasise that I think it's so incredibly important, and particularly when you're looking at other nations globally and the culture there and the impact that bonus, and we're talking Olympic sport, but actually this is just as relevant to Paralympic sport with the introduction of payment on bonuses on Paralympic gold medals, on payments on wheelchair races around the world, and actually, when you're bringing back the human element to this, if you've got an athlete, a Paralympic athlete from a very poor country, actually their motivation to win a gold medal isn't just about standing in the middle of the podium, it's about providing for their family and making a better life. Now, what sort of motivation would anyone, what would you do to save your family from poverty and put your children through education? And I think that's a really important human element to understand as well. And therefore, they are incredibly vulnerable. And the sanctions and the greater and a greater look at those around them is really important in line with that.
Excellent point. Thank you to Kevin Carpenter for your question. We've got about 16 minutes left of this session, so do get your questions in on Twitter, and we'll be going around with some microphones if you want to talk to the panel about our first question. This is Kevin Carpenter who says, and I'll just start with you if I may, Jonathan. Kevin says, in the light of emerging abuse, safeguarding and duty of care scandals in sport globally, are we giving too much attention to our question today on anti-doping as an integrity issue? And as I said at the start of the conference, this is very much about integrity in sport. I suppose Kevin's question is, should we have started by talking about safeguarding and abuse in sport? And are we giving too much focus and attention on doping these days?
Well, I'd agree to this extent. I do think that integrity, anti-doping, manipulation, safeguarding, it should be one conversation and it should be one response. You've seen the IAAF has an athletics integrity unit, not a doping unit, and it has been very successful. The challenges you face in investigating, policing, enforcing the rules are the same across the integrity spectrum. And as Kevin's question points out, there are some significant abuses and problems from other areas of integrity. So to me, the interesting point about doping is that it's the one where all sport, all governments have come together with one response. And you can say what you like about it, that is a much stronger legal mechanism. No provision in the World Anti-Doping Code has ever been successfully challenged. And that's because every sport says these rules are necessary. And to me, if you could do the same in other integrity areas, safeguarding, the IOC has some safeguarding rules and provisions now. If you could have a World Anti-Corruption or a World Integrity Agency, properly governed, I do think it's the same challenge. Doping isn't any different from any of these other challenges.
I suppose the question should be, should we have kicked off today by talking about safeguarding and abuse? And you talked about US gymnastics as well, and there have been so many high-profile cases, Victoria. Or is anti-doping still the thing that we should be concentrating on first and foremost?
I don't think you can put one above the other. They're all important and they're all integral, and we should be looking at every single one of them. I guess that there's been a significant profile around some of the recent decisions and the impact at the most recent Olympic Games, which is why it's such a hot topic at the minute. But no, you can't necessarily prioritise one above
Jeffrey?
the other.
I think the questioner has a point. I think there are other issues in sports that are probably even more to the basic integrity than doping alone, in terms of athlete welfare, in terms of abuses in the system, safety. I think, the issues that exist in the world about head trauma and other things that are not properly being looked at, that there are unfortunately there's so much positive about sport, but there's no shortage of other issues that we should be focused on.
Yeah.
And that's not to minimize the importance of this issue,
of course,
but I don't think it's necessarily the first issue in terms of sports integrity.
Bill, because for so long it has been the topic,
Yes.
isn't it? Especially at an IOC level.
And again, are athletes becoming the great scapegoat? Are we focusing on doping, holding up athletes as that are caught as pelts, or and saying, look, we've done something to attack sport and integrity issues. If we haven't convinced people in the audience about some of the systemic issues in sport, I advocate reading a book that has not hardly a word about doping in it. It's called Red Card, and it's about the scandals in the sport of I call it soccer. Sorry, football.
I was almost going to tell you off. I have this golden rule. If anyone says Premiership or soccer, they're in for a big, big row.
Please forgive me. But it goes back, as Jeffrey has said, to the governance issues. And Jonathan held up the Athletics Integrity Unit. The key to their success and their ability to address a wide range of issues is the fact that they're independent. They have an independent body that governs them. And so we need to start talking about the real governance issues in sport, and I agree, it's across the board. It's not just doping, and doping probably isn't the primary issue.
Okay, we're going to get some microphones. We need a show of hands if anyone wants to ask any questions. We've got a microphone there. As the microphone gets there, Victoria, I just want to ask you a very, very quick question in terms of, if we were to walk out on the streets of London now and just ask that fundamental question about whether they have faith in sports and at an Olympic level, at whatever level, when it comes to doping, what do you think the answer would get? If we question 100 people?
No.
No.
No, everyone I speak to, and that's the sad thing about it, you watch some incredible performances on the telly, and everyone goes, I bet they're on drugs. Everyone thinks that. That's the automatic default now from the vast majority of people that I speak to. And actually, that's so sad, for the athletes that are, slogging their guts out 7 days a week. The training regime that I did 7 days a week, 3 sessions a day, 1 day off a month, and you do that, day after day. There is no Christmas day. You're training, and then you put your performance out there, and then people are questioning it because of the sorry state of affairs. It's sad.
Can I just say I fully agree with that. When people ask what is the purpose of the anti-doping rules, the purpose of the anti-doping rules isn't to catch cheats, to fund a huge industry for lawyers. It's there to allow clean athletes to say, you can have confidence in my performance. And if it doesn't do that, then it's failed.
Okay, I think we've got a microphone to our first question. Hello, what's your name and where are you from?
My name's Tom Murray. I'm an associate in the sports group at Mishcon de Raya.
Hello, Tom.
Hello. I was interested to get your thoughts on the anti-doping approach in respect of US boxing. So obviously there's just been the Anthony Joshua Jarrell Miller scandal, and part of the reason Miller was found was because he was part of the WADA program as opposed to WADA, so he was tested twice a week in the 8 weeks running up to a fight. But one of the criticisms levelled towards US boxing is that a lot of fighters are only tested on the day before a bout, and I wonder if you think that approach is a positive one, what the US could learn perhaps from the British approach.
Did you get that question?
The issues with boxing, professional boxing, I think in the United States, our system needs to be improved. Our testing in boxing, as the questioner correctly said, typically only takes place immediately before the fight, a day before, and the day of the competition. That's in effect an ineffective testing program. Some in the audience may be aware that USADA was signed up to conduct the anti-doping program for Ultimate Fighting Championships, UFC, and they have a global testing pool now that we administer, and we conduct year-round 24/7 whereabouts program and year-round testing, out of competition testing, and that needs to happen. In boxing, they need to adopt some sort of similar system.
And how do you go about doing that then? Is that by talking to each other about the various ways that they test and how sports carry out their testing individually? Is it an open dialogue between the organising and the governing bodies?
Right now, the sport is primarily run by the promoters who set up matches between boxers, and so they just, no organization has implemented a testing program. Each match is kind of sanctioned by the commission in a particular state, and they only have jurisdiction over the period of time the fighters are in their state, and they probably don't have, in most cases, the resources to conduct a robust out-of-competition testing program. So there needs to be an overarching body that does that testing program, probably in the United States or globally.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for your question. Looking for any more questions from the floor? Gentleman on the front there. Good morning to you, sir. Hello.
Good morning. Actually, my name's Robert Smith from the British Boxing Board of Control, and it's quite interesting the question you asked, because the biggest problem with boxing in America is there's no American Boxing Board of Control. In Great Britain and whole of Europe, they have their own commissions and look after things. We obviously deal with UCAN. But the biggest problem we have with doping, certainly with regard to overseas, is that we had a case a couple of years ago that dragged on and was handled relatively poorly, I think. Although I'm not blaming anybody in particular, because there are a lot of incidences with regard to it. And an organisation called WADA, which was set up in America, Voluntary Anti-Doping. And that's generally because the confidence in our system in this country went down the pan, ultimately. And therefore, WADA came on board. And the one issue we've had recently is, obviously UK do all our testing in Great Britain for every championship and out of competition. But now, with a major contest, if it takes place in this country, UK do the test the first test, and then WADA do another test. And recently, we had a situation which I didn't believe was possible, where UK gave a negative test and WADA gave a positive test. And that case is still going on. So America's slightly different because, as I say, there's no American Boxing Board of Control. And you're quite right, sir. Each state looks after itself, and they all have different rules. It's not really a question, it's more of an explanation. I don't know what the answer is, ultimately. In my time working with the board, how long I've got, I don't know. But I don't know what the answer is. But that's one of the problems we have in the sport of boxing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. We've got 5 minutes left, so we're looking for any more questions, either on social media or on the floor as well. I suppose we should just return to our opening question then, Jonathan, really, as we round up. We've got about 5 minutes and 14 seconds left, like our Olympic clock, by the way. Is it a forlorn hope, Jonathan?
Well, I hope not. I focus on 125 people at WADA who work every day on the anti-doping programs that allow the NADOs and the IFs and everyone else to work within the framework that is missing apparently in boxing. It exists because of WADA. If you didn't have WADA, you'd have to have another WADA. You'd have to invent another one, because it won't work otherwise. You'll go back to the Wild West. So let's hope it's not a forlorn hope.
That question that we put up earlier, Victoria, is WADA in complete control? What do you say?
I believe that we do need a WADA. So I'm not standing here to say that we don't. We absolutely do. But we do need a stronger WADA, a more independent WADA, better governance, stronger leadership.
Jeffrey?
And I'd like to see WADA and the rest of international sport reform its governance, that we all take a hard look at that. I think, in fact, boxing is the most extreme example of the other side. There is literally no governance in boxing, and that's why you have no structure at all. And I think right now the international sports movement needs badly needed governance reform. But if those reforms are made, then I don't see why it has to be a forlorn hope. And one of the things that are positive about the systems in the U.S. that we've discussed in collective bargaining, there is generally, putting aside the history of baseball in the U.S., which is a little unique, there generally is high confidence by sports fans in the United States that NBA outcomes or NHL outcomes or NFL outcomes are not heavily influenced one way or another by doping or anything like that. So I think you can create a system that has that confidence built into it.
So that's really interesting. Just pick another, because we do have a little bit of time. That's really interesting. So that question I put to Victoria about if we went on the street and asked 100 people what they thought about the Olympic Games, for example. If we went out on the street and asked 100 people about the integrity of the Premier League, what sort of reaction would we get?
Well, I'll defer to those here in the
See,
UK.
it's an interesting one, isn't it? You know, because you've talked about, you know, say those 100 people in the States who say, I fully believe what happens at the NBA, NHL, completely clean. Jonathan, what sort of reaction would we get if we were talking about cricket in the United Kingdom or rugby union in the United Kingdom or the Premier League?
Premier League, they'd say absolute confidence, because they'd say no drug can make you a better footballer, ignoring the fact that there's lots of drugs that can get you back on the field from Wednesday to Saturday. So there's a fairly superficial attitude in football towards doping in football. But do people have confidence that it's not drug-ridden? Yeah, I think they probably do.
Bill, just a final point on our unified code or forlorn hope, WADA in control?
I think that in an unprecedented way, athletes are engaged and mobilized, and I think that that is a tremendous sign for sport. And we've talked most of the hour about the fact that the big issues that face sport, many of them relate to governance, and a key is athlete engagement, athlete involvement, so that they can be a part of protecting themselves. They are the reason sport exists. They're the reason that we're inspired by sport. And I do believe a part of the answer to the governance issues that face sport are more inclusiveness of athletes. And if we go down that path, then I think that's the right path, and WADA can become more effective.
And may I just spin around the table before we conclude, because it would not be good of the conference to address a breaking story that broke yesterday afternoon, Jonathan, Victoria, Jeffrey and Bill, on Caster Semenya. The Athletics South Africa say that CAS ruling yesterday justifies discrimination. You remember that she lost a landmark case against Athletics governing body. Your view on what we heard yesterday and that news from Athletics South Africa today?
Well, I acted for the IAAF in that case, and it's a bit like the Russia case. The thing I like about courtrooms is all of the polemics, all of the political nonsense falls away, and it's based on evidence and the merit of the argument. And that's the ruling we got yesterday. It was based on evidence, and it was based on merit of the argument and not on polemics.
Victoria, your view on that breaking news yesterday?
I mean, I won't profess to know the ins and outs of all the detail, but I think what's important is exactly what Jonathan said, is that you look at the evidence provided and you make an informed decision based on the evidence. It's the same, you know, we're seeing an emergence of not just the Caster Semenya case, but just transgender sport and athletes entering that sport. And I think it's looking at the evidence before jumping to any conclusions, looking at where if there's an unfairness or a performance advantage that goes above and beyond the need to be as inclusive as we possibly can.
And we're going to talk about inclusivity later
yeah.
today as well. But Jeffrey, very big story, and we've talked about governance and we've talked about athletes' welfare.
I thought the decision was awful. And the reason I thought it was awful is that it is fundamentally sexist. The whole inquiry, and I'll explain why. We're not talking about doping, we're talking about something that's natural. No one asks if Usain Bolt has some genetic advantage that made him by far the best 100-meter runner in the world. And therefore, he should take something to suppress his natural ability because it gave him an unfair advantage over other male runners. It is only women that we look at on this spectrum of sexuality and say, oh, you have an unfair advantage here because of how you're born. I think it's wrong, I think it's sexist, and it's not based on evidence because the whole inquiry is backwards. Now, I should disclose that I represented Kasten not in this proceeding, but in the original controversy a number of years ago. So I have a personal sympathy to her, but I'm offended by the whole way in which this issue has been approached, from my perspective.
Before Bill, Jonathan, can I bring you back in here? We're running out of time before we go to Bill.
There was a very effective advocate who made all of those arguments to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and you had 3 strong judges, and they made a ruling. And guess what? Those arguments didn't win.
Bill?
I think we ought to leave it there. It isn't a doping issue. I think you ought to...
But what we've talked about, it's relevant. You can understand why,
totally.
why the organisation felt that it was necessary to address it on this panel.
Oh, absolutely. I think you ought to have a separate panel, and I think you ought to have Jeffrey and Jonathan back.
I'll ask Richard if there's time in the schedule. Anyone fancy sticking around for that until 5 o'clock? Listen, it's been brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. A brilliant start to our Sport Resolutions 2019. My thanks to Jonathan, to Victoria, to Jeffrey, and also to Bill. Brilliant stuff. Thank you all very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Excellent stuff, and thank you very much to a lot of you as well who are joining in on the hashtag as well as they leave the stage. Thank you very much indeed, brilliant. Thank you for joining in on social media. We've got a little bit of a break now for some coffee and some pastries, ladies and gentlemen, and then we shall reconvene in the auditorium for our second session. Thank you very much indeed.